As we all know, China is a authoritarian regime, and India has been a democracy since its founding in the 1940s. And a lot of people say, well, they say a number of things. They say, first of all, that the fact that one's authoritarian and one is democratic is a reflection of things that happened recently, of the colonial past. So obviously the British transmitted a lot of institutions to India, including the idea of democracy and a secular state and all of that sort of thing. Or communism, created the grounds for the current dictatorship and the like. People also, when they're comparing China and India, sometimes admire the Chinese ability to make decisions. So if the Chinese want to build an airport, they just basically, plow over all the, little homesteads that are in the way of the runways and move the people somewhere else. In India, the whole community organizes, they complain, they protest, they vote, for their member of parliament, and then, the political system then prevents the government from putting in this big infrastructure project. So where does all of this ultimately come from? And I would say that the deep root of this is really not the colonial experience. The colonial experience obviously gave both, or the colonial or the 20th century experience of both of these societies gave certain specific institutions to both countries. But if you look at this longer pattern of history, I don't think it's any accident that China is an authoritarian state today and that India is a democracy. India is not a democracy in the sense that Amartya Sen seems to think that there are deep, precedents for democracy in India, but there are no precedents for authoritarian government in India. There really are no precedents for it. Anyone that has tried to create a powerful, centralized a regime that's capable of really penetrating Indian society has failed, all the way back to the days of Ashoka. And so it is inconceivable that India could be ruled by, a totalitarian regime of the sort that overtook China in the Maoist period. And conversely, the fact that you've got strong centralized government in China also should be no surprise, because what you lack in Chinese history is any tradition of rule of law that would limit the discretion of the sovereign authority in China, and you don't really have organized social groups like a landed aristocracy, an organized peasantry, independent commercial cities, all of which, in the case of European political development, were critical counterweights to the centralized power of the state. And therefore, in a sense, you become path dependent, because once you get this powerful state going, the state can then suppress the organization of new forms of opposition to its rule. So just as, the Chinese suppressed various religiously based peasant uprisings in the Han Dynasty, so they're suppressing Falun Gong today. Now, we're not at the end of this lecture series, so I don't think that we're all stuck in these 2 millennia old historical patterns, but I do think that it suggests that, some of the roots of contemporary political behavior actually are much more deeply rooted than simply 20th century history. So I'm sorry we never got to the other civilizations, but we'll have to try to do that maybe in the next lecture. Thank you very much. So you're free to get up and go, and anyone that wants to stay and ask a question is welcome to. Roger.
This is a little bit discouraging when you think about modern political development.
Why don't you stand?
Why don't you take the mic?
I was saying that sounds a little bit discouraging if you're thinking about modern political development, because based on what you just finished saying, there's a certain element of predestination and inevitability the way societies develop. And if that's true, how can we influence the future direction of development if it's all preordained?
Well, okay, I never used the word preordained. I just said that there are certain long-term patterns, historical patterns, and if you don't take account of them, you're really not going to understand where any of this comes from. But this is something I'm going to try to elaborate further in the last lecture. When you get out of the Malthusian world that you're living in here, and you enter, past the Industrial Revolution, when you enter into a period in human history where you have possibilities for continuous economic growth, then a lot of these considerations begin to change because, among other things, it creates a much more fluid social environment. You have middle class, you have other actors that can get rich outside of the purview of the state. And I think that to the extent that there's a hope that you're going to get democracy in a country like China, and I believe that that is entirely possible, in my lifetime. We'll see how long I live, but I think it's entirely possible. It's going to be because in a modern globalized capitalist economy, the state simply cannot snuff out all of its competitors, and that from the bottom you get a lot of organization of new social actors that simply would not have existed in any of these earlier historical periods. Now, there's an Indian counterpart to that is, will there ever be an Indian state that is sufficiently powerful to really break the caste system or, change some of these deeply rooted social practices? I kind of doubt it, but on the other hand, in India as well, you have the same phenomenon. You have a middle class, you have entrepreneurs, you have the growth of a modern economy that bubbles up, parallel to these old institutions, and that again changes the whole complexion. Plus globalization, plus all of the external influences and ideas that come in. So I don't think it's quite as pessimistic as you might think. Yeah, David.
Okay, you said that China is this perfect example of Charles Tilley's theory of the state making war, and that sounds rightfully plausible and so forth. But Charles Tilley also argues in that book that, he's got that full cartoon panel version of how history folds out, and it starts with a king wearing armor, it ends up with the prime minister or president wearing a suit and worrying about the voters. And that, he argued, provided one of the other pillars which you refer to of accountability. Now, if China is such a perfect example of the first part of the Tilley thesis, why doesn't it develop this accountability, which Tilley also said happened in Europe?
Well, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait around for Lecture 4, which is all about accountability. But a short version of that is as follows. The modernization process involves state building, which is to say the concentration of state power, centralized state power, and accountability arises because other political actors are able to organize themselves in a sufficiently cohesive way that they can prevent the state from undermining them. And where you get accountable government is where one of those actors, like Parliament, becomes so powerful that they can actually force the king to back down, right? And that's really what's never happened in China. In this historical period, the big difference, I think, between China and Europe was the aristocracy, because in Europe you had a very powerful landed aristocracy that resisted state centralization, and in China, for a variety of reasons, their aristocratic class was much more dispersed, weaker, didn't have its own military forces, and therefore could never force any Chinese monarch to accept any degree of real accountability. So I think that's a kind of nutshell. Cinnamon.
Frank, thank you very much. That was brilliant and really, really provocative. You talked about the role of religion in the state, and you talked about the Prophet Muhammad, and kind of intimated the role of religion, and you just touched on it in India with the Brahmin class. I wonder if you could just delve a little bit more deeply into the role of the religion and the state, and how that shaped the theory and thinking about the state.
Again, the next lecture, which will be in 2 weeks, is about the rule of law. And the story of the rise of the rule of law is entirely a story about religion, because in my view, you don't get genuine rule of law except out of religious sources. And so for that reason, the Christian West, the Muslim world, and India all have something that identifiably look like the rule of law. But China has never had it, because China, really never had religion in the sense that any of those other civilizations did. I mean, they had ancestor worship, and then in Chinese history, most religion is kind of protest religion. So you get Buddhism and Taoism, and a lot of times these are ways of mobilizing peasants or, people that are not in the elite, and organizing them against the state, and then the state beats them back, and the Confucians kind of end up on top again. And for that reason, you never had a separate class of priests that were the guardians of law. So that's one important way that religion impacts political institutions. But essentially religion solves this problem that the rational choice people can never really quite explain, is that why do these rational actors decide to cooperate with one another at certain circles of cooperation? And I think what religion does is it provides people a basis for cooperating that goes beyond their material interests. And so, as I said, you can see this very clearly with the rise of a powerful Arab state in place of Arab tribalism once you have the introduction of Islam. Yes?
The comparisons between warring states China and early modern Europe, they seem to be a lot of natural analogies. I'm not a classicist, but is there anything to be gained looking at classical era European state formation, or is that they're just less fruitful?
I'm sorry, which period of?
Well, Roman Republic or Greek city-states, or any of those earlier periods of European Mediterranean basin state formation in comparison to China?
Yeah, I mean, this book has taken a lot of work, and if I had more energy, maybe I could have, put in a few chapters on that as well. It just seems to me that whole period has been covered rather well in Western historiography, and I don't think that you're going to find a terribly different story, about the relationship of military conflict and the emergence of these higher forms of political organization. It's just that I didn't pick Rome in particular because I just think that in many ways the Romans actually never achieved a very, they were successful in the sense that they cobbled together this big empire, but they never created anything remotely like what the Chinese did, which was a centralized bureaucracy that could actually penetrate society. In fact, the Romans didn't even offer citizenship to everybody that lived in the Italian peninsula. The social wars were all because other people wanted to be Roman citizens and they wouldn't let them. And so, the real core of Rome was actually a very small political unit, despite its long-term reach. So.
Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I think it's great that you've looked into the ideological sphere in addition to the materialist one, because a lot of people read books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and you're left wondering why not India, and it doesn't really have a good explanation. My question is, if you compare India and Christian Europe, you have also a clergy and a priestly class.
Yeah.
And you also have many different ethnic groups that are in divisions that are difficult to put together, yet Europe does, the different states do go out and conquer. And I was just wondering why you think that is. Is it because maybe one group is able to incorporate conquered peoples into the religious ethnic group and the other isn't? Or is it reproductive restrictions on the priesthood, or
So I'm sorry, the question is, why is Europe more successful or less successful than India?
More successful at imperialist expansion.
Yeah. I would say that there are probably a lot of specific reasons that are rooted in it's rooted in geography and in some of the details of religion. So that, for example, I don't think that Christianity ever quite stood in the way of the penetration of European states into their society. Well, okay, actually, let's back up. Part of the lecture I didn't get into was why did tribalism disappear in Europe at such an early date? And the basic answer to that is the Catholic Church. I mean, it's really the Catholic Church that on a social level killed Catholicism, already by the 7th, 8th centuries, this was all disappearing. And so to the extent that kinship was an obstacle